This day and age, people are highly dependent on the grid for their survival. They rely on electricity, running water, heating and cooling systems, and food from the grocery store. History has shown us, however, that disasters can and will happen. Things such as natural disasters like tornadoes, earthquakes, and hurricanes are inevitable. Things like economic disaster, global conflict, environmental catastrophe, and pandemics, although less likely, are probable nonetheless. Even highly improbable scenarios like meteor impact events, robot takeovers, alien invasion, and even the zombie apocalypse still theoretically could happen. In this video, we will discuss a model I created to help understand the probability of these various scenarios happening to help guide you in prioritizing your emergency preparedness planning. So let's get to it. This video was brought to you in part by Silky Saws, the sharpest, fastest cutting, and most capable saws for survivalists, bushcrafters, and preppers. Go check them out on CanadianPreparedness.com. And don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified when new videos are posted. Enjoy the video. If you're just getting into emergency preparedness planning, it can be a very daunting task. One of the first things you need to ask yourself is, what am I preparing for? It's very easy to obsess about one specific scenario and tailor your entire preparedness strategy to that one thing. Take, for instance, somebody who's obsessed with the idea of a supervolcano eruption, and they might base their entire preparedness strategy around that scenario alone. While there is a slim chance of this happening in our lifetime, making it the focal point of your preparedness planning could have a detrimental impact in that you may be less prepared for more realistic and likely scenarios that are of a much smaller and more short-lived scale. So I've come up with a few different criteria to determine the probability of various events happening. Now, there's 1,001 unfortunate and unexpected events that may create disaster for you and your family. Disaster is best measured on how it impacts you, the individual. And by this definition, anything can be a disaster. A divorce, loss of a job, a death in the family, a fire at the home, extending outwards to things of broader reach which are going to affect more people, like pandemics, terrorism, solar flares, artificial intelligence takeovers, self-replicating nanotechnology run amok. It's important to remember that what's most likely to happen are things on a personal level. Now, we're not going to talk about those personal disaster scenarios today because you could make entire videos on each and every one of those personal disasters. In this video, we're going to focus on things which affect more than one person. So that could be anything ranging from a contained active shooter scenario up to the level of natural disasters, which could affect things on a county, local, even statewide scale, moving up to things of more regional significance, and then national, and then global in scope. So we're going to examine the likelihood of these disasters happening. Now, we're going to base it on the following criteria. Is it anthropogenic? Meaning, is it man-made or is it not man-made? If it is a man-made disaster, is it intentional or is it by accident? If the event is not man-made and caused by nature, is it a disaster which was spawned by events originating on this earth? Or is it something that is celestially influenced, like a solar flare or an asteroid strike? Another criteria we're going to use to determine probability is, has it happened before? Has it happened several times before? Does it occur in a regular pattern? Or is its occurrence entirely random and unpredictable? The next criteria is, what capacity does man have to mitigate the issue? For example, man may be able to use drugs to contain a virus, but may be helpless against the eruption of a supervolcano. The next criteria is it local or global in scope? It's quite obvious that local disasters are far more common than global disasters. In fact, a global disaster, such as World War II, is a very rare occurrence. So keeping these dimensions in mind, let's discuss what would be the most probable global disaster scenarios. One of the highest risk scenarios possible is going to be a pandemic scenario. The reasons why is because this is something that has happened throughout history before. It happens with regularity. The conditions are very ripe for it to happen. As we become a more urbanized and globalized culture, where international travel is the norm, where access to clean drinking water is limited, and sanitation is substandard. Additionally, genetic modification and meddling, monocultural agricultural practices, the lack of species diversity, which translates into a lack of resilience to various mutations, which translates into a lack of ability to adapt to highly contagious and lethal pathogens. Almost every epidemiologist agrees that we're long overdue for a pandemic, and it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. A pandemic that could wipe out tens of millions, possibly billions of people is a very likely scenario in the near future. We can look back at the plague of Justinian, which at the time killed almost 15% of the world's population. This was a form of bubonic plague. Back in Europe, in the Middle Ages, the Black Death killed nearly 150 million people, or 30 to 50% of the European population. The major plagues of days gone by were bacterial in nature, and now with the increasing antibiotic resistance of the population due to antibiotic overprescription and overuse, the threats of pestilence once again are not only limited to viral outbreaks. The Spanish flu, which came about after the end of World War I, is estimated to have killed between 50 to 100 million people. And it's important to note that pandemic may not be the cause of SHTF, but it may just be another consequence of ecological or economic disaster. The completely unsanitary conditions of people who live in third world slums, in contrast with the whitewashed and hyper-sanitized Western world, is a recipe for sheer disaster. Namely, because the people who've grown up in those derelict environments have immune systems which are hardened to far more pathogens than people who grew up in a hyper-sanitized society. So theoretically then, a pathogen could originate in one of these toxic environments, be inadvertently transported to a place where people have no immunity. People will begin contracting the illness, and as the illness spreads from person to person, it will gain more virility and strength to the many random genetic mutations that might take place thereafter. It should be understood that a pandemic that could not be immediately treated would completely shut down society. It only takes 10% of people to not show up to work to create a domino effect, which would ripple throughout the entire system, thereby causing the temporary collapse of that system. Imagine, for instance, if 10% of the police force fell victim of this virus. You might think that while there's still 90% of the police force to help enforce the rule of law, however, because of that decimation of the police force, crime is going to increase, people are going to violate quarantine zones, which is going to lead to higher contamination rates, is going to cause a runaway effect in which more and more police are going to become infected. So the initial 10% is pretty much the gateway into full-blown collapse of the system. And of course, you have those who are just not going to show up to work out of fear of contracting the illness. And the police are just one example. Imagine the people who work in the water treatment facilities, in the power plants, other first responders like EMTs, firefighters, trades workers, industrial workers. The whole system will be brought to a standstill in the case of a pandemic, and how fast society would recover from such a thing is anybody's best guess. Remember that when the plagues of antiquity happened, people were largely living in rural environments. Now you have megalopolises with huge population densities, concentrations of people, breeding grounds for parasites and the effective transmission of disease. To survive a pandemic scenario of this sort, I would recommend having at least 6 to 12 months worth of food stored, in addition to sanitation supplies like calcium hypochlorite. This is a powdered substance that you can use to make bleach, and you can use that bleach to decontaminate certain areas and keep your space clean to prevent or at least slow the spread of any sort of infection. Additionally, biohazard waste disposable bags, Curad antiviral face masks or N99 masks are going to drastically increase your odds of surviving this scenario. So the next scenario, which is not only likely to occur, but by many accounts it is inevitable. And it's probably not going to be too far off, and that is economic collapse. The probability of this event is very high because it has happened before, and not only that has it happened before, it does happen with regularity. Boom and bust cycles are an integral part of the current global monetary paradigm. Another reason why it's likely to happen is because not only can it happen on its own, it can also be triggered by intentional human activity. The economy is not like a volcano where we have absolutely no control over it whatsoever. We indeed have control, and there are some people who arguably have the ability to manipulate. And of course, it would have global implications. Should one of the dominoes fall of one of the major players, particularly the United States, then many other countries would follow in suit. There would be a ripple effect across the world that would feel the impacts of the collapse of the US dollar. Now, although we can expect regular boom and bust cycles, I don't think that's what people are referring to when they're talking about the big economic collapse, which may be around the corner. This could be triggered by a variety of things. It could be triggered by the economy reaching its ecological limits in a scarcity of resources. It may well be triggered by the increased automation. It's predicted that 800 million jobs around the world will be automated by the year 2030. That means potentially hundreds of millions of people will be out of work because, of course, many of those people will find other jobs, but they're probably going to be jobs which pay less and require them to do more, which has been the trend over the past 30 years, such that the so-called wealthiest countries of the world have a direct predictive relationship with the amount of debt, meaning typically the wealthier your country is, the more debt you're in. Even though the general standard of living has increased as a result of technology, people's debt loads have also increased to the point in which people's individual debt for student loans alone in the United States is $1.3 trillion. That's not including the national debt as a result of the quote-unquote quantitative easing strategy of the Federal Reserve. As jobs are lost, this is going to require more government intervention in order to provide social security to these millions of people. In addition to this, we also have the baby boomer pension crisis, which is literally here and happening right now. We have an aging population and we have a younger population that has less disposable income to provide for the aging population, 1/3 of which have not saved any money for retirement. Some have even predicted a new and even bigger housing bubble in light of the fact that banks have now made it easier once again for people with high debt loads to take on mortgages. Now, in order to escape this grind, some people are looking to digital currencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum. The whole idea with a digital currency is that it's a decentralized worldwide currency, meaning that it is not regulated by any individual country's government. These cryptocurrencies have no allegiance to any particular country, and they can't be devalued, at least in the case of Bitcoin, because there is a fixed number of Bitcoins available, which is not to say by some people's arguments that the price of Bitcoin cannot be manipulated in some shape or form. I personally am not a cryptocurrency expert. I don't believe that it's going to be the holy grail. As people say, money has to come from somewhere. When you make an investment, somebody out there is laboring so that that money can make you money. The same would have to be the case with Bitcoin. Money just doesn't manifest out of thin air. Somebody's labor is going to contribute to that wealth that was generated somewhere down the line. As people lose their jobs and technology starts to take on more of the tasks of everyday life, we are living at a time now where you have all of these factors intersecting. You have the aging population, you have the development of artificial intelligence and robotics, those being blended with biology in order to create the transhumanist movement. At the same time, you have rapid environmental degradation, you have the economy which is teetering on the brink of collapse. You have many stalemates on the global geopolitical front around the world. You have the genetic modification of food, You have genetic manipulation and reproduction, and all of these things are focused around the nexus of the next 15 to 20 years. What it's going to look like, God only knows. One thing is for certain, that you absolutely must be prepared to weather the potentially long, drawn-out, incremental degradation that will be economic collapse. It may not be an overnight Black Thursday 1929 scenario. It may well be something which is very, very drawn out, to the point in which many people are finding now they have absolutely no disposable income to invest in extra preparedness measures. If this is the case, I would encourage you to work harder now while the getting is good. Get a second job, because you may be kicking yourself down the road when you don't have that luxury of getting a second job, even if it sucks. Now is the time to capitalize, because like the virologists that predict the inevitable pandemics, many economists are predicting a very similar bleak scenario. So get ready. Be sure to check in tomorrow for part 2 of this series, when we talk about the possibility of cyber attack and the effects on the grid, as well as environmental disaster. So stick around. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.